Today we do a pin wash and paint some details and more details and do some chipping. Hello guys, so today's video will be all about the finer details, initial pin wash and finally paint chips on our tiny Tiger 1. I have already added a few decals off camera and additionally varnished the tank completely with a satin varnish from VMS to unify everything and give the acrylic paints and also the oil wash a good basis to work on. I start with medium grey color to first block the tracks in. Normally I like to paint tracks and road wheels separately from the tank, but in this scale everything is a bit harder, and in the end I had to attach everything right on the tank. That's why I now have to struggle my way through this bit of work. But don't worry, you won't have to suffer through this stage as much as I did. Next up are the road wheels. Here it's pretty much the same. Normally I like to paint the rubber parts with one of the great AK real color markers, but this time I had to use a brush and fiddle it between the road wheels and the tracks. I just used a slightly more black mixture for this compared to the tank tracks. I'm sure that the application of dust and dirt later on will make sure to hide all my mistakes I made, but I honestly could not be bothered to be super clean, since I wanted to start with the fun parts. Next up is blocking in the tarps that I created during the building stage. They are sculpted directly on the tank with the dedicated paper and paper shaper from VMS. I block them in with pretty much black paint as a base coat for maximum contrast, and later on they will probably receive a nice finish in German field grey or something similar. It was the first time that I made tarps with the paper from VMS, and I have to admit that I quite like this small detail, which gives the tank a more lived-in appearance in my opinion. The towing cables received the same treatment. For now, everything just receives a base coat in either black or medium grey, just as a basis for more detail painting right before I finished the tank. Now it's pin wash time. I like to use oil paints for pin washes and weathering effects instead of pre-mixed enamel paints. Since this tank is in the tiny scale, I decided to use Abteilung 502 Industrial Earth because it's not a super dark color. Additionally, I prepared a drop of the color Dark Rust, which is a medium dark brown, which I also added a tiny bit to the mix. For a bigger scale, I probably would have gone with mixing dark brown and black for the pin wash to achieve a higher contrast, but I didn't want to push it immediately. We can reinforce the pin wash later on without any issues if the details are not separated enough. My initial mixture was a bit too thin, but later, when a bit of the mineral spirit I used for dilution evaporated, it worked okay. Due to the satin varnish I applied over the whole tank, the pin wash flowed quite nicely into the recesses and around details. One of the biggest advantages of oil washes are the working time, in my opinion. Of course, if you want to rush through a project, this might be an issue, but the fact that you can leave them dry overnight and react to them with mineral spirit the next day and blend them to the degree you like makes them quite enjoyable for me. Sometimes I don't have too much time available for painting, and therefore it's pretty convenient for me. VMS has the so-called Oil Expert product, which can be used instead of mineral spirit and reduces the drying time to just a few minutes or hours, if you prefer to work with oils but don't like the extended drying time compared to enamel washes. Pin washes are one of my absolute favorite stages when painting, because I think this is when you get the first time a real feeling for the final appearance of your model. The separation of the hatches, weld seams and reinforcement of details with the outlines it creates just never get old. Everything just pops a lot more than before and transforms even a tiny model like this into a more lifelike appearance. Just look at how much it transformed the road wheels from those boring dark yellow discs into the classic tiger road wheels we all know from pictures. It's always great to see your models come to life. Of course, if you really like, you can just use the pin wash as a kind of filter or global wash over the whole model and just blend it in or completely erase it when it starts drying. This way you can immediately set the first weathering stage on your model. I'll probably use oil dot filters later on, so therefore I tried to stick to using it more or less strictly as a pin wash this time. Now it's the next day and I use a makeup sponge which is lightly saturated with mineral spirit to clean up the oil paint. Make sure to remove excessive amounts of mineral spirit from your sponge. It should just be slightly damp, not wet. For some parts, I prefer to use just a regular synthetic brush, since it gives you a bit more control in areas that are either more delicate or not easy to access with the sponge. Depending on what you would like to achieve at this stage, you could also already create some kind of streaking effects on the hull and turret. As you can see, it's pretty easy to blend all the unwanted stains of the dried oil paint with a slightly dampened brush, even on the bigger surfaces. If you never have tried oil paints for this, give it a try. I can definitely recommend it. So, this is our result so far. What do you think? I think it looks good considering the size. All the details are easy to distinguish and readable, but the contrast is not completely overdone. Now it's time to paint some highlights. Therefore, I bring back all the initial colors and mix them with dark yellow. Well, except the dark yellow. For this, I brought back the P3 Morrow White. With these mixtures, I basically highlight all the raised elements a bit to make them look more defined and in some places maybe even slightly weathered. Of course, you can also do this step later on with oil paints, but I made easy and quick work of most of the details in just a few minutes. This technique basically helps you to bring back detail that may have been toned down by our airbrushed camo and of course also the pin wash. In figure painting, especially wargame miniatures, it's also a regular use technique to edge highlight either certain panels or edges or just all. I'll do it for now on most easy to reach edges and especially on the turret. In a few minutes, when we start with the chipping, this will be a great basis for the darker metal chippings around the edges of the armor plates. Also, the nuts and bolts on the wheels look way more defined after quickly going over them all. Now I repeat the same steps with the lighter version of olive green and for sure also with the red-brown. Follow it to a level that you like. This steps is definitely a bonus and no must. I'm even sure that some people will dislike the results, but considering the size of the tank, I'll take every tiny bit of subtle contrast I can find. Now let's start with the sponge chipping. For that, I ripped off a tiny piece of a kitchen sponge and put it in my self-locking tweezers, which is a great tool for that. Make sure to wipe off the excess paint from the sponge until there comes nearly no paint off when you dab it on the paper. Then it's exactly the right amount for tiny armor chips. I like to focus around the edges and the parts where two armor panels meet, but hatches and the spaces around them are also a great place to focus on. Of course, you can also do it by brush, and certainly you'll later see me add some of them by brush in spots where the sponge could either not fit or where I just decided that I want more randomness and a few more of them. I prefer to use heavily thinned paint for this, because otherwise you could risk texture buildup when the paint is too thick. First I started pretty subtle, but later on you'll see that I went a bit overboard. Well, chipping is just a lot of fun and gives the tank immediately a more heavy and used look. So it's always hard for me to judge the right spot to stop. But like with all stages we go through, don't worry if you went a bit overboard, because later on we will have a few tricks in our sleeves to tone that all a bit down. Next up, we jump right into the dark metal chips. I use dark grey this time to represent bare metal, but a dark brown is also popular and of course fine if you want to have a more rusty look. First, I started painting it right in the spaces where I already had some of the lighter yellow chips, and right on the edges, just right there where it would make most sense that the paint could have been rubbed down to the bare metal. I tried to make it random and not too regular, and I find this is pretty relaxing work, especially on a tank that size, since you can be done in relatively no time. Does look pretty good already, yeah? Well, I thought it's not enough, so I decided to get the sponge out again to go all over the tank with another layer of dark grey steel chips. Granted, on the wheels it was a solid decision, but I'm not so sure for the rest of the tank. Well, surely it's not completely ruined. Well, you can decide that for yourself, and make sure to let me know what you think in the comments, but I'm pretty okay with the outcome. The tank does definitely look like it had its fair share of battles, but not completely exaggerated. I'll definitely be a bit on the brakes when it comes to rust, and probably reserve that for the exhaust and maybe a few tiny spots on the hull. Well, that is all for this video. I hope you enjoyed the video and could maybe learn a few things, or just enjoy watching me paint this tiny tiger. Both would be great and certainly appreciated from my side. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know by commenting, liking this video. Also, if you want to see more of these, make sure to subscribe. Over 90% of my viewers are not subscribed, so make sure to do that, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye!